Hola! How is everybody? Hot? Yeah, it's hot here too. I'm going to talk to you about this particular emoji. Who knows what this is? Raise your hand.
Good to go.
Who has given this emoji in a process? Raise your hand. This is something that is famous or infamous in the world of software developers, and usually stands for the acronym LGTM, looks good to me. And in the context of code reviews, we use this to say, yep, everything looks great, everything looks good, usually, and everything is ready to go. It's ready to be merged into production, it's ready to progress in the process. It is great. But unfortunately, sometimes when we give this emoji, that's not the case. We actually it does not look good to us. The rest of the process looks really, really bad. And over the last decade of my experience in software development, I've spoken to so many developers, I've been on many different teams, and there's one consistent theme around code reviews, and that's people don't love them. We know that we need them. We know that they're critical. We're not really against them. We see the value of code reviews, but sometimes the process that we have on our teams is just really, really bad. And so that's what I want to talk to you about today. What are we doing wrong in code reviews? Hint, there's a lot. How do we fix those things? And after we get through those, which I consider the bare minimum for an effective code review, what can we do to go beyond bare minimum code reviews? So, what are we doing wrong? When we ask ourselves this question, we have to take a look at it through two different perspectives. In this case, we have to look at it through the reviewer perspective and the author's perspective. So the reviewer, meaning those who look at the code changes that are prepared, and the author, the person who wrote the code and is putting up their changes to be reviewed. We will start with the reviewer. Who here has reviewed code at some point? Who here has loved reviewing code? Okay, some hands. Who has hated having to look at someone's code? Yes. Was it your own code a month later? Yeah. We'll get into why that might be. So, what are we doing wrong? The first thing we're doing is we're not leaving our ego at the door. Sometimes when we get into code reviews, we get into these really long discussions of like, you should have done it this way, or this would have been a better way to do it, and without explaining why, or something that usually is good and actually matches the acceptance criteria or has matched what has been discussed is put on hold and is not approved because the reviewer has this kind of ego trip and is using their power to delay the code review. You have those, well, actually, who has a colleague like this? Who's sitting next to them? That's why they can't. There were some brave people in the back. They're like, I have a colleague like this. And this is a really, really big problem because a lot of people dread having to go through code reviews. We already know it as something of a critical process, something we don't like to do. And so when we have people who bring their ego to the process, it just makes it so much worse. The next thing we do wrong as a reviewer is to focus on the developer rather than the code. So following this ego, sometimes when we leave comments or when we leave suggestions, we don't tend to focus on the code. We say, why did you do that? Or why did you choose this implementation? Or you really did this? And this is a problem because there's a paper that actually studied where they looked at different code review comments and they tried to see which ones were toxic, and which ones were not toxic, which comments were labeled as toxic and which comments were labeled as non-toxic. And one particular finding in this paper was that the use of second-person pronouns at the beginning of the sentence is more likely to be impolite. So if we take a look at the words that they looked at through all of the code review comments that they have assessed, these are the words that were statistically more likely to be in toxic comments, And these are the words that were statistically more likely to be in non-toxic comments. If you take a look at the toxic comments, if you want, do you think, you are, you think, you want, you, your. The only exception here is could you, which is considered non-toxic because it's a form of being polite when making a request. That is the only exception when we're talking to the developer where it is not considered toxic. The next thing that we do wrong as reviewers, we skim through reviews. Who feels this tweet? Who has skimmed on a review because you're like, I'm not freaking going through all those lines. I'm not going through all those files. Or maybe it's not even that malicious. Maybe you're like, well, I trust my colleague, right? And I think what they're doing is right, and I don't have time to do this, so looks good to me. This is a really, really big problem with reviewers. And while the author has a very big part to play in why this is a problem, as reviewers, this is still part of our responsibility. Because as reviewers, what's the point of going through a code review if we're not going to give it a proper review at all? The problem is a lot of us as reviewers have this mindset that if there is a problem that ends up happening in production, and even though it passes through our review, if it has a bug, it's the developer's fault, right? They'll just fix it. It has nothing to do with me. And that is the wrong mindset to have as reviewers. Finally, the last thing we're doing wrong is a very, very big one, is writing ineffective comments. That's probably 80% of the job as a reviewer, is to write comments that are actually effective. Ineffective comments are usually one of three things in my experience. They are either very, very subjective, like return the result in an array instead. Or they're unclear, so this could be better. Or they lack an outcome. There's something wrong here. What am I supposed to do with that feedback as an author? What am I supposed to do? There is an unclear, it's unclear if I have to do something. You're causing more work for the author because they now need to say or ask you, find out more information. Do I have to do something here? What exactly did you mean by this? What changes do I actually have to do, if any? And that is the result of writing very ineffective comments. So those are all of the things that we do wrong, the most concerning ones. We don't leave our ego at the door. We focus on the developer rather than the code. We skim through reviews, and we write really ineffective comments. These are all the things we do wrong as reviewers. So how do we fix those things, you might ask? Well, first of all, forget your ego. I don't care if you're a senior, you're a tech lead, you're a junior, you are an ivory tower architect, you are someone who has access to code. If you are reviewing code, it doesn't matter who you are, forget your ego, full stop. That's not part of the process, and that is something that should not go into the code review. Part of that is to focus on the code, not the developer. So as you're reviewing the code, if we take a look back at that paper that looked at toxic versus non-toxic comments, you'll find that a lot of the software engineering related words are actually those that are cited as non-toxic. So if we take a look back at those, the words tests, unit, file, files, pull request, the pull request, anytime it is focused more on the actual code or the pull request or the technical aspects of the code that you're reviewing, they are less likely to be viewed as toxic. And when comments are less likely to be viewed as toxic, they're less likely to be ineffective and they can progress the process forward. The next thing we should be doing is proper, thorough reviews. So yes, there is a responsibility to the author, we'll get there, but it is also our responsibility to actually give it a proper review. So how do we do that? One study says that if we review code in 25 to 45-minute focused bursts, we are actually able to give code reviews a proper time. Because anything after 45 minutes, they find that the human just tends to get more weary. They get less focus. They don't want to focus on this. They get a little less, they have less ability to focus on what is actually happening. Now, this number might be different for all of you. This is just a guideline, but they found in this study that if you are able to review code within this time range, it is more likely to be an effective, thorough review. Another thing we should do is don't be afraid to send back PRs that are too large. That is absolutely something that should be a possibility on your team. If it is way too large for you to review, we do not want to skim through the review. So we don't want to just say, looks good to me. We want to stop that. What we want to do is tell the author, hey, this is not acceptable. And also, if you're expecting me to give this a proper review, there's no way I'm going to be able to properly review 500 files. Ask yourself, are you going to be able to review 500 files thoroughly, properly, effectively? No. So do not be afraid to send back PRs that are way too large. The mindset that we have, where we're like, well, if the developer has a bug, it's their fault. That's not the mindset that we should be having. What we should be saying to ourselves is, how did I miss that? We as reviewers are part of the team. We collaboratively co-own the code that we are all contributing to. So rather than just saying author versus reviewer, it's the team's code. And if we have this mindset of, in my review, how did I miss that? We are more likely to give it a proper review rather than just saying, oh, it's the developer's fault, they'll take care of it. We should have some accountability as well in the process as a reviewer. Otherwise, what are we doing that process for? And finally, writing effective comments. This is probably one of the greatest skills that you can learn in code reviews to make them so much better. So these are things that are the complete opposite of ineffective comments. They are objective, they are as specific as possible, and they usually have a focused outcome. So being reviewers, we need to be objective. That's imperative. And in order to be objective, we need to suggest with facts. If you're going to tell me to do something or ask me to make a change, tell me why I need to make that change. Tell me why an implementation is better that you're suggesting. Anything that you are adding as a comment and giving to the author, you need to make sure you suggest with facts. Similarly to that, before you ask for a change, ask yourself, why are you wanting to make that change? In another study that looked at code review comments, they found that developers who first reflected on the change that they were about to ask and kind of asked themselves why they wanted to make that change, they ended up doing two things. One, they were able to further clarify why they wanted to make that change and validate that the change is needed, which means when you go to leave that comment, you're able to better articulate what you want changed in that comment. If you don't validate that change, and in your introspection, you find sometimes you don't actually need that change. And so that is a very important thing to do, is to first ask yourself, why are you about to ask for that change? Is it really warranted? Is it really needed? And then finally, target the code as presented to you. Whatever is in the pull request, whatever code has been changed, that's what you look at, that's what you decide. As reviewers, we need to be specific. I don't know about you, but anytime I receive comments on a pull request, I automatically assume that all of those comments mean there's something that I have to do, that there's work tied to every single comment. But that's usually not the case. Sometimes there's only 2 or 3 that I really need to pay attention to, and others are not so important. So, understanding that, we need to be clear if something needs to be done. Who here uses nitpicks in comments? Who knows what a nitpick is? Who leaves nitpick comments on code reviews? Don't raise your hand, I will come for you. Nitpicks, for those who don't know, are things that are very subjective, preferential. Things like styling, formatting, you missed a space here, you missed a semicolon here, you didn't do this correctly in terms of formatting or styling, and you sometimes have really, really long debates of what the proper way the code should look is. Instead of going through all of that, you can use something similar. Here is a comment signal, meaning we use a label to say what kind of comment it is. In my team, we usually use these ones. So if something actually needs a change, we preface the comment by saying needs change. And we use that for anything that requires a small change, something that can be done within an update to the PR and doesn't have anything else larger than that. If there's something that you find and there's actually way more rework that needs to be done, or there's more discussion that needs to be had with the author, we used needs rework. And this typically involved a conversation. We don't go through comments back and forth where there's like 97 comments in the thread. We talk to each other, because if we're not on the same page and we're already going 2 comments, 3 comments in and are not aligned, it's better to just get off of the text version of communicating and actually go on a video call or tap them on the shoulder if you have the ability and talk it through. And one really important part about that is when you decide what it is the outcome of this conversation. Let's say you actually do need to do rework for this change. Go back to that initial PR and write a comment that tells the rest of the team or whoever else is going to look at that PR what actually was decided. Why was this not going through? Why was this PR closed? If someone just puts another comment there that says, so-and-so and I discussed this, we found that there was way more rework and re-architecting that needs to be done. I'll be opening a new PR when that is finished. This is how those little bits of knowledge that get trapped within individual people don't get shared, because things like this don't get updated and things like this don't get shared across the team. So that's really important, that if you have an offline discussion, to at least go back to that PR and write an update about the outcome of that discussion. There's another thing called conventional comments. Who here has heard of conventional commits? All right, so this is the same. This to me is a little bit on the extreme side for myself personally, but conventional comments is kind of the same thing. What they do is they have a set of labels to use, and they have a way to categorize your comments in this very standard format. So you'll see here the way that they do it is they have a label, they have decorations, which are optional, and then they have the actual comment, which is the subject. And for some people, they like to use this because they can parse this as JSON and do some other really cool analysis on their code reviews and all the different comments that they have, like so. And some of the labels that they strongly suggest using are praise, suggestion, issue, to-do, question, chore, note. For me, this is a little too much. And for our team, we didn't need all of these labels. But for some of you, maybe that is a way to categorize your comments. So either way, as long as you are able to categorize the comment and make it clear if something needs to be done or not, whichever way you choose is particularly up to you and your team. Pinpoint what it is that you're talking about. Most of our code review tools already do this. So for example, only highlight the relevant code that you are discussing. Sometimes people highlight the entire file, and that's not actually what I need to look at. I only need to look at like lines 3 to 15. But if you have that ability, only highlight what you are discussing. Explicitly call out the method or variable or class name that you're referring to. And if necessary, actually call out the line numbers that you're referring to in your comment. The more precise you can be, the less likely the author is going to misinterpret your feedback. The less likely it is for the author to be like, I don't know what they're talking about, I don't know what they're referring to. You get onto the same page much quicker if you're way more precise and specific in your comments. And finally, as reviewers, we need to provide a focused outcome. So focused outcome, in a different code review study, a paper showed an analysis between which comments were useful now versus not useful. And what they found was in the useful comments, those that contain some sort of verbs that denote transformation, those were typically labeled or looked at as useful comments. And so with that, I've developed something called the triple R pattern. If you're having trouble asking the author to make a change, or if you're having trouble formulating how you want to make a suggestion, you can use this pattern. It is the request, rationale, and result. Request is what's a sentence explaining what it is that you'd like the author to do. The rationale, it's a sentence or two explaining why the request is warranted. Maybe you include references or links to justify and support your requests. Are there blog posts that you've seen that justify what you're asking about? Do you have team conventions that say this is the way that we do it, and that's why you're asking them to make that change? Anything that can support what it is you're asking the author to do is good to put here in the rationale. And then the result, a measurable end state that the author can compare to. Maybe that's a metric that they have to reach. Maybe it's a screenshot of what the actual interface has to look like. Sometimes it's literally the code. But providing a measurable end state, the result that you're actually looking for, makes it much easier for the author to understand what it is you're asking them to do. So as an example, if you want them to move a method, request, can we move this authenticate user method into our authentication utilities library? Why? Well, we have similar methods that are already in that library. Justification 1, justification 2. Also, this is used more than a few times, which warrants its place in the library. Lastly, we have a team working agreement that says this is what we do with these kinds of functions or methods. So we move it into that library. So the result, after this change, we want to make sure all of the calls to authenticate user are in this library rather than a standalone. If you want to request a more meaningful variable name, request, can we rename the variable item to something less ambiguous? Rationale, well, the name item is vague. It provides very little context within the scope, and you have lost the notion of the discounts being applied, depending on what we're talking about, right? So result, variable name item is changed to something more meaningful. Here you can even add suggestions of what you think is more meaningful and help that along. So request, rationale, result. Tell them what you want, ask them what you want to do, rationale, explain why you want them to do it, and then the result, something that they can compare that change to. So as a reviewer, we need to forget our ego. We need to focus on the code, not the developer. We need to give proper, thorough reviews, and we need to write effective comments. If we can do all of those 4 things, we can make the code review process way more effective and also be way more happy as reviewers. So now we know what we're doing as reviewers. Now what are we doing wrong as authors? We have a lot that we're doing wrong as authors. I'm sure you are thinking of some right now as a reviewer, and we're going to go through them right now. The first thing is we are not being our own first reviewer. We just send up a PR and we're like, it's not my problem now, I'm done. I've submitted the PR, I just got to wait for the reviewer to be finished. And that's a really big problem because we have typos that are missed, we have things that were not linked, we have documentation that was forgotten to be added. There are lots of silly little things that are missed because we're not being our own first reviewer, and that in turn makes the code review much longer. It takes so much longer because we miss those little things. We don't use any automation during development. Who here uses automation during development? Do we use linting? Raise our hand. Woo. So linting, having some rules that dictate what your code should look like syntactically. Who uses formatting rules? So all of those discussions in code reviews are like, oh, you missed a space. Oh, you forgot a semicolon. Oh, you need to have a line break between the variable declaration and logic. All of those things, first of all, you need to agree with your team what those are. And then if you have those rules in place, you can then automate that and fix all of that during development. These should never make it into the code review. These are things that, again, prolong the code review and are the comments that we just absolutely hate getting. Who would you rather ask you to fix these things? Your computer? You know, have it yell at you? Have the computer yell at you, not your colleague. You're more likely to fix those silly little issues. Things like static analysis. Who uses static analysis during development? Okay. So this, for example, this code will never be reached. Using static analyzers, if you have the capability to, we'll be able to check a lot of those things, again, during development. Fix all of those things prior to getting to the code review. And finally, who does tests? Who runs any type of testing during development? before you actually open your pull request, or even as a pre-build check. These are all types of automation that can rule out the lower stakes issues in code reviews. These are the items that we shouldn't have to get into in a code review because they waste time. We want to find the higher stakes issues. We want the reviewers to focus on things like edge cases or things that are security vulnerabilities or things that only understanding the code base, maybe the legacy portion or a specific quirk of the language, those are the things that reviewers should be looking at, not any of the things that can be fixed by automation. Next, making our PRs unmanageable. What is an unmanageable PR? An unmanageable PR is essentially a gargantuan, really large, not cohesive PR. They are things that have too many files. They are things where changes aren't atomic, meaning the pull request does not focus on a single feature that is self-sustained. One thing, focus on one thing at a time. Or if you have a larger feature, multiple parts of that larger feature are in that single PR. So that's how we get these really, really giant PRs that nobody wants to review. These are the things that we need to take time to break down as authors. Make sure you don't have some random files stuck in there. Make sure your last git stash that you've popped in there is actually related to the change that you want to have reviewed. All of these things are our responsibility to make sure that the pull request is as narrowly focused and as specific as possible for the reviewer to review. Make them as small as possible. Part of that is not only do we send really big PRs, we also treat PRs as mystery novels. Who here has sent in a PR like this? I would be ashamed too. I wouldn't put my hand up. But as a reviewer, receiving this kind of PR, what kind of bug fix? Even the commit is not helpful at all. We are now spending way more time figuring out what it is that we're trying to look at, what it is that we're trying to review. And this is our job as authors to actually add the context in here, to make it easier for the reviewer to see what it is that they're reviewing. And lastly, we tie our worth to our code. This is really, really hard because we're all human. And after spending weeks, months, crafting the perfect solution, it's like this baby, right? And you're like, it's perfect, please review it. And then a reviewer gives you feedback and you're like, what do you mean? It's perfect. There's nothing wrong with it. And sometimes we tend to think that we are not good at our jobs, or we are an idiot because we didn't see something that the reviewer has pointed out. All of these things are things that we should not be doing. Just as we ask the reviewer to focus on the code and not us, we also need to be receptive to any feedback that we receive and accept it as things to improve our code, rather than to say we are not doing a good job. We need to take a look at this as an opportunity to improve the code as a team, as a whole. So those are all the things we do wrong as an author. We are not our own first reviewer. We do not use any automation during development. We make our PRs unmanageable, aka they are way too large. We treat PRs as mystery novels. We don't add any context in the pull request, and we tie our worth to our code. So fixing those things, be your own first reviewer. If you have to open a draft PR, do that. You can review your own code as many times as you want, and that's the greatest part about that. Review it, anticipate what the reviewer is going to ask, see if you've answered those questions, and see if you've added enough context for the reviewer to properly review the code. If you are putting up this pull request and you have to go on vacation, ask yourself, will they have to call you on vacation to make sense of what you're trying to send in the PR? If they do, you don't have enough context in the pull request. So make sure you add all of that context in there. Let the robots take over during development. Most of you raised your hands for all of the things that we want: linting, formatting, static analysis, testing, and that's great. The more that you can automate during development, the more that you can take away those silly, lower stakes issues, the less that you'll have to deal with them during the actual code review. Make PRs manageable, aka make them smaller. That's the trick here. Manageable PRs, they focus on an atomic change or feature. They only include what's necessary for the changes to work. Don't add any unnecessary configuration files. Don't add unnecessary changes that you were working on from another feature. Make sure that they are as clean and narrowly focused as possible. Split multiple parts into multiple reviews. Imagine again yourself if you had to review one really large feature. It would be impossible to do that in a thorough way. One other thing to note is if you do have features, one feature that is really, really large, one thing that you can look at is maybe there's something that's lacking in the planning and design phase, something way, way prior to the code review process. Ask yourself, when you are planning out your stories or tasks and you are doing all of this, you need to ask yourself, why can you make it as small as possible? And because if you make it as small as possible, then you can make that smaller PR in the end. Manageable PRs can also be reviewed in 10 to 20 minutes. One study shows that they are typically under 500 lines of code, and in a Microsoft study, they are typically less than 20 files changed. And then solve the mystery. When you are filling out your PR, it needs to have the why. What it is that you are asking the reviewer to review. Put all of that context in there. Don't make them work for it. And finally, remind yourself that you are not your code. So do all of those things. Be your own reviewer. Let the robots take over during development. Make PRs manageable. Solve the mystery. Add all of that context in the PR. And remind yourself that you are not your code. And we're going to go rapid fire here because apparently I have no time. So if you want to go beyond bare minimum reviews, first thing you can do, create a team working agreement. All of those things that you implicitly believe about your team, make them explicit in a document. Your team coding conventions, what your process is, what your definition of done is. Put all of that in a document that you agree to and enforce as a team. If possible, use PR templates. For example, help the author put all of that information in there. For a bug fix, what are the reproduction steps? What are the root cause? What's the fix? This is an example template of what you might ask the author to add in the PR if they were sending up a bug fix. If possible, auto-assign reviewers. In Azure DevOps, there is a way to automatically assign reviewers based on what part of the code base has changed. Adding that makes it much easier for authors to properly assign the best reviewers in a PR. And then explore informational reviewers, people who don't necessarily have approval rights or need to approve, but are put on a PR to make sure that knowledge is spread and shared. This is great for new team members for onboarding or for junior developers who need to take a look at how code reviews are done and what kinds of discussions are made when doing a pull request and doing a code review. And then finally, code compliments are encouraged within reason. If you find something that's really, really novel, you can say so. Code reviews don't have to always be a critique. They can also be a place to show your colleagues that you appreciate and are amazed by the really novel solutions that they find. So do not settle for code reviews. Strive for great ones. So muchas gracias, Jay on the beach. Whew.